Well, I've always said that at some point the General Staff would tell President Putin that it would be useful to be on the Dnieper River line, that you might as well just occupy and take all the territory up to that river line. It's a natural barrier. Uh, for hundreds and hundreds of years, it was the western frontier of Europe. Kiev, under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was a fortress of the West. Once you passed Kiev, once you passed that river, you were dealing with Tatars, Mongols, and Russians. You know, that's it. So I think if I were on the Russian general staff, that's what I would argue for. This is a defensible river line that gives us a buffer zone, if you will, and we are in a position to do whatever we need to against the western portion of Ukraine if it comes down to it. If anything's being demonstrated in this war, is that the strike capability, precision strike capability, whether it's a drone or cruise missile or ballistic missile, theater ballistic or strategic, there's nothing they cannot hit and destroy. And if you occupy that river line and you are compelled at some point to cross it, well, you're already there. In other words, you're not moving from a few hundred miles back. You're right up on the river. And so if you have to stage in order to cross to extinguish whatever heinous regime comes to power in Kiev, although I don't think Zelensky will last much longer. And if he does, he's not going to be replaced by something worse. I think there'll be a more amenable group at some stage. But then you have that benefit. Now, the one thing that he can still do that he hasn't done is he can cross the river and attack from the north down into Odessa. Odessa historically was Russian, never Ukrainian. And if he did that, that would strangle Ukraine. It would have no outlet, would have difficulty shipping grain and other products from Western Ukraine to other countries. Now, it doesn't mean that the Russians could cut them off completely, but it would certainly put them in a position to do so. And it may be that the Russians decide to do that as a matter of self-defense. I don't know. I just think that the best thing that we can do is to get out, but no, I don't have any support for that here in Washington. Everyone in Washington, with very few exceptions, wants to fight until every Ukrainian is dead and everything is destroyed. And that Western Ukraine could be made to look like vast areas of Eastern Ukraine. I think that's catastrophic, but there's not much there's not much informed thinking about these matters in Washington. There's a lot of narcissism in the sense that our national policy is mortgaged to vanity. That we can't sign on for anything that we don't quote unquote impose. President Trump can't do anything that doesn't reflect on him as a great man and a victor and a winner. So the idea that he could simply say, this was a mistake and I'm leaving is anathema to them. And the sad part of, as you know, is that when it came to the end of Vietnam, that's what we did. We just left. What happened in Iraq in 2011 is the last U.S. military column came out of Iraq in the dead of night. And they came out unannounced because whenever they told someone in Iraq we're leaving, as soon as they started to leave, they came under fire. They didn't come out during the daylight because they would have come under fire. So we essentially left Iraq at that point, I would argue, having been defeated. And then the same thing was true in Afghanistan, only the departure was an exercise in incompetence and imbecility. Every mistake you could make, everything that violates any common sense on the military side was ignored. So how many times do you have to fail? You look at Libya. What did we do in Libya? Well, Libya is split into two. You have essentially Eastern Libya that is allied with Egypt and Western Libya that is apparently Turkish and influenced by us, and we're keeping that pot boiling, which is a disaster. I would just say that, what we should do is something that President Trump used to talk about, but now apparently doesn't want to do, and that is to divorce ourselves from all of these military commitments overseas. Get out of this, because wherever we've been for any length of time, it's been a disaster. It doesn't work.
Yeah, the thing is, if he would have just cut his losses immediately, then it wouldn't have been blamed on him. But now that he's kept this war going, I think he's got yeah reasons to fear that once this whole thing collapses on itself as another Afghanistan, that he will be held accountable. But this is what seems to be in the works because there's an article recently, I can't remember Forbes or Washington Post, in which it argued that yeah, the Russians are pumping out a lot of heavy military equipment, tanks and everything else, but very little of it is being sent to the front, as instead they're building up a huge, powerful force in the rear. Well, what do you see happening? What do you think the Russians are going for? Are they planning a major offensive? If so, what is Trump going to do if he loses the war, which is now effectively Trump's war?
Well, you're asking me what Trump's going to do, and I don't think Trump has got much that he can do. I mean, what, announce more sanctions? That's ridiculous. We've already sanctioned 34, 35 countries. We have a trade war underway with at least 90 countries. There's nothing he can do, certainly not militarily. I think the Russians have always been wary of what might happen with NATO, especially if we gave a green light that troops could move into Ukraine or something. And so they have always held back a very strong reserve to deal with that potential. I think that's what they're doing now. And remember, this man Putin knows the history of the region. He doesn't want control of Western Ukraine. He knows that, especially the further west you go in Ukraine, the more distinctly non-Russian the people are, and their culture and their language and so forth. He doesn't want anything to do with that. You've heard, you're familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and one of the things that he urged in Russia was divest yourself of all these foreign peoples that you're ruling. You know, the Tsarist empire is over. Forget it. It was, it's dysfunctional. In other words, we should try to focus on Russians, ruling Russians and nobody else. They've largely managed that. I think it's certainly an 80% solution. And I'm sure he feels the same way about Ukraine because even though Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, well, the Ukrainians are Slavic Orthodox Christians like ourselves, he knows enough about Ukraine to know that the West is not that way. What used to be called Galicia and Ruthenia in the old Austrian Empire, those people are very definitely not Russian and will never be Russian. And he doesn't want to force that. So I think he understands the dynamics very, very well. He also is a patient man. I think he'll continue to exercise patience. Patience has paid off for him. He's sustained very few casualties compared with his predecessors. I've never seen, looking back on Russian history, any single Russian leader that was as concerned about Russian loss of life in a war as he is. And that's not a weakness. You know, you listen to all of the generals, retired generals that have been telling us for years, Ukraine is winning and the Russians are losing. Uh, they say, well, that's because Russia's weak. Russia's not crossing the Dnieper because it can't. Well, that's not true. And I think that we're going to watch a number of things happen over the next month or two. And I would not be surprised if the whole picture changes quite suddenly. I don't think that Zelensky is going to survive this. And contrary to what a lot of people think, the public opinion on the whole in Ukraine wants an end to the war. The people suffering most have said, we've had enough, but they're not allowed to have an impact. And that, of course, is because the Ukrainian secret police will show up and you too can end up with a bullet in your head. Maybe you end up being shipped off to the front to die there. So this will eventually end, but it's not going to be anything that we do to end it.
Well, how do you see Zelensky's rule coming to an end? Do you think the Russians will take him out, or will the Americans want him away? The nationalists, the military,
In different
or
times, I think the West would have said enough's enough. I think more sober-minded people back in the 60s or 50s or 70s would have intervened quickly. Soon after the intervention began in February of 2022 and said, we need an end to this. The longer you wait, the more territory you lose, the worse it will get. Sign the paper and shut up. I think that would have happened. But we aren't led by those kinds of people today. Those people were eminently pragmatic. Look at Eisenhower and his support for Austrian neutrality. As president, he said, that's wonderful. The Russians want to withdraw? Fine. He said, by the way, why don't we make more countries neutral? Because we Americans don't have the military power to defend everybody. And at that point, NATO was half the size or less than it is now.